Acts 27:9-20. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement, that is, Yom Kippur. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor or the sails and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day it began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. At an estimated net worth of almost $200 billion, Warren Buffett once said, "Wall Street is the only place people drive to in a Rolls Royce to get advice from people who ride the subway." Not all advice is equal. Sometimes you need a different angle, as we find out here in Acts 27. This centurion has a decision to make. Do I listen to the pilot and owner of the ship or Paul the prisoner? It seems like a no-brainer. You gotta go with the ship captain who paid for the ship, runs the ship, knows the ship, and most concerned with keeping it intact and the cargo safe. But as we read carefully, we find that the centurion gets advice from three different sources. In verse 11, the centurion goes with the pilot's advice. In verse 12, there's a majority vote to keep sailing on. And in verse 13, the circumstances change, and that led to a decision to keep going. In Proverbs 13, verse 10, it says, "Wisdom is found in those who take advice, but dilemmas like these demand a decision-making calculus for how we take input. All advisors aren't equal." In 1 Kings 12:8, it says, "Rehoboam rejected the advice that the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him." Before we wholesale accept the advice of family or friends, we got to examine if there's any implicit bias or motive one way or the other. And finally, in 2 Samuel 16:23, it says, "The advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God." Wisdom from spiritual advisors has a premium on it. And if there's anything Paul had proven up to this point, he was devoutly religious. Eyewitnesses saw him do miracles, and here he was being escorted from the court of kings to the emperor himself. That centurion should have weighed out his advisors a bit more carefully, and we should too.